it's time to do an updated build of our Bleeding Whirlwind Barbarian. This is still, in my opinion, the best Barbarian build you can currently get in Diablo 4, and this is post all of the Whirlwind nerfs. Now do keep in mind the footage that I'm showing is nowhere near with min-maxed equipment. I still have a ton of upgrades to get, but we're already critting for 100, 200, or even 300,000 damage on most enemies. It is absolutely ridiculous and so much fun to play. You might think just pressing Whirlwind and spinning to winning isn't a lot of fun, but now there is actually a little bit more nuance to exactly what you need to do to maximize your damage, and timing of your shouts is now really important. But we're going to be going over everything that you need to know about this build, and this is an updated build to the one that I used for leveling that I made a previous video on, which is definitely viable for leveling up through the game and getting through World Tier 3, but the build we're covering right now is geared definitely for more World Tier 4 and Endgame stuff, mainly because we had to make a lot of changes for survivability and damage output to really maximize our survivability in higher and higher tier nightmare dungeons. Now before we get into the equipment, abilities, and Paragon board, we're going to go over the technique and expertises that we're using for this build. Currently I'm using the two-handed sword expertise as my technique because this is going to apply 20% of our direct damage as bleeding over 5 seconds. This is really important for our build, and we'll get into why when we go over the abilities and our Paragon board. Now since we have this applied as our technique, it's going to be utilized on any weapon that we decide to use. Now currently for this build I am using two one-handed swords, which give us a 10% chance to gain 5 fury when hitting a crown controlled enemy, double this chance when using two swords. So we have a 20% chance to gain 5 fury when hitting a crowd controlled enemy, and since we already have the bleeding effect from two-handed sword expertise, when we get into our abilities we're going to be speccing into the bonus that gives slow, which is a crowd control, which means we'll always have a 20% chance to get that extra 5 fury. Now as I mentioned, my armor and weapons are nowhere near min-max. I've actually had really bad luck with drops and rolls lately. We're going to go over what I'm currently using and what we can swap around to make it even better, and the stats you should be prioritizing on your weapons and armor. Let's go over the weapons first. For my two-handed legendary mace, the legendary aspect I'm using is skills deal up to 40% increased damage based on your available primary resource when cast. Receive the maximum benefit while you have full primary resource. When Whirlwind activates, what it does is it takes all the bonuses that you currently have on your character and carries those throughout the duration of Whirlwind. So this means if you activate it at your full resource, you're going to get an increased 40% damage throughout the duration until you stop. The stats you should be prioritizing for your weapons go as follows: vulnerability first, then crit damage, then damage to close enemies, and core skill damage. If you can't get all 4 of those on a weapon, then you're not going to want to try and min-max that as much as possible and wait for something just a little bit better. I also have a full video on how to perfectly min-max your equipment and how to understand how to break through item level power to get even better stats, so make sure to check that out on the channel. I'm not going to explain it in this video. For a second two-handed weapon, I have each point of fury you generate while at maximum fury grants your next core skill 3% increased damage up to 45%. This is nowhere near the best roll that I could have gotten on this, but it can still provide us with better damage, although I do think getting a really good barrier damage increase and putting on our two-handed weapon would be a better static damage increase. I just haven't gotten another one in like 4 days. Speaking of barrier damage increase, we do have that on our one-handed weapon, which deals 16% increased damage while you have a barrier active. This is pretty much the worst roll I could have gotten. On my other one-handed weapon, we have attacking enemies with a basic skill increase the damage of your next core skill by 8% up to 30%. This is going to come in handy because we actually will be utilizing our basic skill to ramp up our damage before entering Whirlwind. Now for our amulet and rings, I've been experimenting with a couple of different things, but on our amulet, I really like having Whirlwind's critical strike chances increased by 11% for each second it's channeled up to 32%. Yes, you get a little bit more of a bonus when it's equipped onto your two-handed weapons, but once you start upping your critical strike chance enough, I think having the benefit of having it on a two-handed weapon gets diminished over time, but you can swap these around if you so desire. Now this is the ring that I have been kind of swapping in and out. I've been testing to see which I like more. I have Mother's Embrace equipped right now, which has if a core skill hits 5 or more enemies, 20 to 40% of the resource cost is refunded. I got a really bad roll on this one, but I've just been testing it. Otherwise, the main one you want is your shout skills generate 2 to 4 fury per second while active. I've got 3 on this one. And what I've been testing is utilizing Mother's Embrace while I'm clearing dungeons, and then anytime I fight a boss or just a single target enemy, I use the shout skill regeneration one, which I think is working really well for me. But just in general, the shout one probably a little bit better if you don't want to be swapping anything around. And then the most important one that we have here is whenever you cast a shout skill, its cooldown is reduced by 1.7 seconds per nearby enemy, up to a maximum of 6 seconds. This one got hugely nerfed on the last Barbarian nerf, but it's still really good to have. Since I've been working my way up through Nightmare Dungeon 40, it's extremely easy to get one shot out of nowhere, so I do have a lot more defensive stuff in my build at the moment. Like on our helm, we have damaging an elite enemy grants you a barrier absorbing up to 3,497 damage for 10 seconds. This effect can only happen once every 30 seconds. The interesting thing about this one is it does scale up over time. So as you progress through the game, you're going to find more and more powerful barriers, which can become incredibly useful. This is honestly one of my favorite things, especially when you combine it with Temerity, which, when an effect that heals you beyond 100% life, grants you a barrier up to 72% of your maximum life that lasts for 8 seconds. This is amazing and frankly should probably be in almost every build. This is the main reason I've been able to just continuously clear higher and higher tier Nightmare dungeons. And when you combine it with this massive barrier that only happens every 30 seconds, you can pretty much have a barrier up all the time. On my chest piece, I have a lot of damage reduction, which I highly recommend rolling stats for damage reduction on your chest. I have reduction to close enemies and reduction while fortified. I actually need to re-roll that fortification one, because quite frankly, I'm not a big fan of fortify, and we'll get into why a little bit later. This legendary aspect has been saving me a lot. You gain 0.5% increased armor for 4 seconds when you deal any form of damage, stacking up to 50% armor increase. And since we're dealing damage all the time, you can stack this up to 50% almost immediately, allowing you to take significantly less damage. And then the last piece that I've been experimenting with is Whirlwind explodes after it ends, dealing 25% of the total base damage dealt to surrounding enemies as fire damage. This one got nerfed heavily as well, and I've still been debating whether it's worth using or not. It can come in super handy if you've been whirlwinding for a while and then you get stunned, and it can kill all the enemies around you, allowing you to live through the stun. But its range is also not very long, and it's debatable whether or not you should be including it in the build. I've been using it currently, but the other one that I definitely recommend as well is damaging an enemy with a core skill has up to a 32% chance to extend the duration of berserking by 1 second. Double this duration if it was a critical strike. With this, you can maintain berserking almost all the time and is arguably significantly better now than the Gore's devastating grips, but I still like swapping both of these around. Now, the other main thing that you're going to want to be focusing on your gloves is crit damage, crit chance, and whirlwind, and I definitely recommend getting +4 ranks of whirlwind on here. I've made a video on how to make sure you can do this, and many of you are probably like, well, why add 4 ranks? You could probably just remove those and add it to other things. But those extra 4 ranks, putting us at 9 out of 5 ranks of whirlwind, is actually a 29% damage increase over just having the base 5 stacks. That's a static all the time increase. It's pretty amazing. And then on our boots, whirlwind periodically pulls enemies to you. It's also arguable if you could replace this with something else as well. I've had instances where whirlwind almost never pulls enemies to me, and then I have it happen where it goes all the time, and I really can't figure out what actually makes it proc and what doesn't. But considering the way that we've built this out, having a chance to have all the enemies around us can be incredibly useful, so I'm using these on my boots at the moment. Now to get into the skill tree and Paragon points. As you may have noticed, there are so many different things you can change around depending on your personal playstyle, and I've actually been experimenting with different basic skills. The ones I've been using the majority of the time have been Lunging Strike, Enhanced Lunging Strike, and then Combat Lunging Strike to get into Berserking. But since I've been moving up into the Nightmare Tier Dungeon 40s, I've decided to go with Frenzy into Enhanced Frenzy, and then Combat Frenzy because we gain 8% damage reduction for each stack of Frenzy we currently have, which means we can gain 24% damage reduction. So you can see how depending on the situation you're in, you either go for more damage or more defense. Then obviously we are stacked fully into Whirlwind, and then Enhanced Whirlwind to gain that extra Fury, and then Violent Whirlwind for the 30% damage increase. We also have 3 points into Pressure Point, because we want to be applying that vulnerable status. Then we have 1 point into Rallying Cry with a 2 bonus from our items. Enhanced Rallying Cry to get unstoppable so we can get out of stuns and freeze and all that stuff. And then Rallying Cry generates 20 Fury and grants you an additional 20% resource generation. I also have 1 point of Outburst and 1 point as Tough as Nails, so that way our thorns apply bleeding damage, which is very important, just to have bleeding damage as much as possible. It could be argued that these 2 points could be put into the Imposing Presence, but since I can still get 2 more points from exploring the world map more, I want to put those extra 2 points into Imposing Presence later. We then have 1 point in Challenging Shout, Enhanced Challenging Shout, and Tactical Challenging Shout, so that way we get Fury every time we're hit. We have 1 point in War Cry, Enhanced War Cry, and Power War Cry for a damage increase. And then we've taken all of these skills for 3 into Booming Voice, 3 into Raid Leader so we can heal for 3% of maximum life per second, and then a Guttural Yell, so that way enemies deal 12% less damage to us for 5 seconds, every time we activate a different one of our shouts. I have 3 points into Aggressive passive resistance for another 9% damage reduction while berserking. And then we have 3 points into Pit Fighter, 3 points into Slaying Strike with an extra from one of our items, and then 3 points into No Mercy. I also have 1 point into Tempered Fury and 3 into Invigorating Fury, so we can heal 9% of our maximum life for each 100 Fury spent. And then we have Wrath of the Berserker, Prime Wrath of the Berserker, and Supreme Wrath of the Berserker. Now our key passives can be changed up. You only want to use Unbridled Rage if you are not finding yourself Fury starved. This key passive is not recommended for most builds until you have the ability to generate more Fury than you need almost all the time. This is a very hard key passive to maintain. Everybody recommends it, but I don't think anybody actually talks about how much of a pain it can actually be. Yes, you get an extra 135% increased damage, but it costs significantly more Fury, and if you can't maintain Whirlwind with this, then the increased damage doesn't make any sense. And what I recommend is using Unconstrained, which increases Berserk's maximum duration by 5 seconds and increases its damage bonus by 25%. You're going to be in Berserk almost all the time with this build, so getting a static 25% damage increase rather than a static 135 if you can't maintain Whirlwind and you're always Fury starved, then this is something you should be swapping around depending on what gear you have and where you're at progression wise through this build. But if you do build it out relatively close to the way that I'm doing it, you shouldn't have any problems with Fury unless you're fighting just one single target, and it can get really bad when you're just fighting one thing. Let's go ahead and get into our Paragon board. I'm still in the process of min-maxing our board here, but our main board I just kind of have progressed up through here on the right side to get increased physical damage and all of that. The glyph I'm using is Seething, which currently gives me 38.9 damage with swords, and we're using swords. And while wielding a sword, you gain 3 Fury when you kill an enemy. This significantly improves our Fury generation and damage. Absolutely love this glyph. Once I rank it up to level 5, the damage increase is going to be significantly better. I then progressed up this node here to get some armor, and we also get, since it's a rare node, an increased 7.8% damage with swords. We then progressed up this side. For some reason, I can't remember the name of the board, but it's the one with Blood Rage. This is all about dealing extra damage to bleeding enemies. I haven't gotten to this one yet where killing a bleeding enemy has a 10% chance to grant berserking for 5 seconds, but this one is very important and you're gonna have berserk up all the time. Essentially, we progressed up this way to get the damage increase to bleeding enemies nodes. The glyph I'm using here is Martial, so as we expand this out, it'll get better. So we get 2.5 damage to bleeding enemies, we get damage reduction from enemies that are bleeding, which is really good, and then after casting a shout skill, the active cooldown for every shout skill is reduced by 1.2 seconds. There's other ones you could probably put in place of this, but just reducing our shout skills as much as possible between gear and this is really nice, and it comes in so handy. From here, you just want to either go for damage reduction, which I did because I'm progressing through higher tiers, or try and get to this blood range node. Down in the bottom right corner of this, you have more damage to bleeding enemies, which is really nice. These damage increases are so good. And then we progressed over to this board over here. This one has the bonus of Flawless Techniques. So this is the one-handed weapons one. Eventually, I might go up for this, but really the main goal of this board was to be able to get enough of these willpower slots to be able to use Disembowel. This increases our physical damage over time. That's not amazing, but what I do really like about this is killing a bleeding enemy has a 10% chance to reduce the cooldowns of your non-ultimate active cooldowns by 1 second. Since we're always killing bleeding enemies, 10% chance is pretty low, but even just getting a few seconds off of these really large packs, especially when you encounter packs of massive amounts of elites, this can come in super clutch. This board also has a lot of critical strike damage increase, which is nice, and damage with one-handed weapon increases. Since we're dual wielding swords, this board is actually really good. There are other glyphs that I recommend as well, like Ire, which has for every 5 strength purchase within range, you deal 1.3 increased damage while berserking, and if you get the bonus, you also take 10% less damage from elites. There's also Exploit 2, which has for every 5 dexterity purchase within range, you deal 1% increased damage to vulnerable targets, which is really good, but then the bonus is really good as well. When an enemy is damaged by you, they become vulnerable for 3 seconds. This can't happen more than once every 20 seconds per enemy, but frankly, just applying vulnerable guaranteed at the beginning of the fight is going to drastically increase your damage anyways.